This video was brought to you by Skillshare. As you probably already know by now, things aren't going well for the Tories. Sunak and co are bleeding voters in all directions, and polling currently suggests that they could win less votes than Nigel Farage's Reform Party and less seats than Ed Davey's Liberal Democrats, paving the way for what some commentators have started describing as a Labour supermajority. But while most of the media's attention has understandably been focused on the impact that this could have on the Tories, there's been surprisingly little said about how this might affect the question of Scottish independence, which could plausibly struggle to maintain its momentum. So in this video, we're going to take yet another look at those polls, with a specific focus on Scotland, why you might expect Scottish independence to struggle in the context of a Labour supermajority, and why a lot of this really depends on Labour's attitude to the Union. Before we get into it, we recently announced that we're launching a physical magazine about the UK's election, which will include articles about Labour's plan for Britain and a review of the Tories' 14 years in office. So if you want to support our journalism, then consider learning more or even buying a copy by clicking the link in the description. So let's start by taking yet another look at the polls, because in the last week or so, we've had a couple of MRP polls which suggest that we're on track for a truly unprecedented result at the next election. For context, multi-level regression with post-stratification, or MRP polls, are widely considered to be more accurate than normal polls, because normal polls assume a uniform swing across constituencies, while MRP polls segment voters into fine-grained groups and then map swings within those groups onto demographic changes within constituencies. MRP polls were first used by YouGov in the 2017 election, and their impressively accurate predictions in both 2017 and 2019 have given them an almost mythical status with UK politicos. Anyway, in the past week, we've had three big MRP polls. The first of these came from Survation, which suggested that Labour were on track to win 456 seats, compared to just 72 for the Tories, 56 for the Lib Dems, 37 for the SNP, and 7 for Reform. The second came from Ipsos, and it suggested that Labour were on track to win 453 seats, with the Tories on 115, the Lib Dems 38, the SNP 15, and Reform 3. And the final one was published on Wednesday, with it coming from YouGov, suggesting that Labour were on track to win 425 seats, the Tories 108, the Lib Dems 67, the SNP 20, and Reform 5. And all of these polls are so ridiculous that the Tories have apparently given up on actually winning the election, and are now instead warning voters about the danger of a so-called Labour supermajority, urging them to vote Conservative just to make sure there's an effective opposition. Now, as I said in the intro, for understandable reasons, much of the media's attention has been focused on what a Labour supermajority would mean for the Conservative Party, and whether they could even survive this year in their current form. But a Labour supermajority would perhaps have as large an impact on the question of Scottish independence. Put simply, a Labour supermajority would be bad news for both the independence cause and the SNP for two reasons. Firstly, for the past 14 years or so, the SNP have benefited from the Conservatives' enduring unpopularity in Scotland. It's allowed them to frame themselves as the protector of Scottish interests, and claim that Westminster is irretrievably disconnected from Scotland. The second issue is that while a Conservative majority might have been optimal from the SNP's perspective, a Labour minority, or even a narrow majority, might have been almost as good, because the SNP would have the leverage to be able to tell Labour that they'll provide the legislative support they need for their centre-left policy programme if they give them an independence referendum. This is something that the Tories effectively weaponised back in 2015, when David Cameron argued that a vote for Labour would pave the way to another Scottish referendum. Obviously then, a stonking great Labour supermajority is the worst outcome from the SNP's perspective, because it means that they don't have an unpopular Tory government to kick at, and they don't have any leverage in Westminster. And this would compound upon two pre-existing problems for the independence cause. The first is Brexit, which has made things a lot harder for the SNP, because if an independent Scotland were to rejoin the EU, which is apparently what the SNP want, this would imply some sort of regulatory border between Scotland and England, given that England is no longer part of the EU. The second, though, is the Supreme Court's ruling from 2022, which said that any new independence referendum requires consent from Westminster, which means that the SNP can't unilaterally legislate for a new referendum, no matter how well they perform at Scottish or national elections. You get the idea then. There are good reasons to think that Scottish independents might struggle to maintain momentum under a Starmer supermajority in Westminster, which, according to polls, would be significantly more popular in Scotland than its Conservative predecessors were. And Labour would also have little incentive to even negotiate with the SNP on another independence referendum. Nonetheless, the SNP are apparently undeterred. At their manifesto launch earlier this week, while their new leader John Swinney did talk a bit about turning the SNP into a, quote, moderate left-of-centre party in the mainstream of Scottish public opinion, i.e. turning away from the cultural issues that have preoccupied the party for the past few months, he also made it clear that independence was still their main priority. I mean, this was the first page of their manifesto. How all of this plays out then, and whether or not the question of independence remains a politically live one into Starmer's first term, will probably depend a lot on how the SNPs perform at the elections. Despite a series of scandals, constant infighting, and a new leader, the SNP are still polling above 30% in Scotland, neck and neck with Labour, and support for independence remains above 40%. This means that a whole load of seats are essentially a toss-up between the two parties, which is why polling varies so wildly. Of those 3 MRP polls we mentioned earlier, the Ipsos one predicts the SNP winning just 15 seats in Scotland, while Labour get 34, while the Survation one has those numbers essentially reversed, with the SNP on 37 and Labour on 14. If the Ipsos poll ends up being correct and the SNP go down to 10 seats or so, it's hard to see independence remaining a live issue in Scotland. But if the Survation poll is correct, then it's a whole different story. In the longer term, though, a lot will depend on Labour's attitude to devolution. In the manifesto, it seems like Labour basically wants to do 2 things. Firstly, it seems they want to increase Scottish influence in Westminster via a new Council of Nations and Regions, as well as rejuvenating the Scotland office. Then, secondly, they want to extend devolution, but not to the Scottish government in Holyrood. Rather, they want to devolve more powers away from Holyrood towards Scotland's regions, similar to their plans for regional mayors in England. This could be a politically savvy move from Labour, as it takes power away from Scotland's national parliament without stoking Scottish resentment towards Westminster. If all of this works, then it could mitigate demands for Scottish independence by refocusing voters' attention away from national questions like self-determination and towards local issues like public service provision, while simultaneously assuaging Scottish indignation about Westminster's centralising tendencies. A week or so ago, we announced that we're working on a physical magazine which dives deep into the upcoming UK general election. But it turns out that designing a magazine isn't all that easy. So I headed to Skillshare to take a look through some of their design courses, including the incredibly helpful course, How to Design a Magazine and Learn InDesign, which helped me to, do both things. This means that unlike when I tried to learn InDesign for another never-released project a few years ago, I was guided through the process quickly and efficiently. And this time, the project will actually see the light of day, thanks to Skillshare's incredibly easy-to-follow guides. It's not just that either. You likely already know that Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, with thousands of classes led by industry experts across film, illustration, design, freelance, and more. But Skillshare can also help take your career or side hustle to the next level, with hundreds of career-focused classes too. That's courses on everything from how to start a business to maximizing your workflow, or even how to grow in e-commerce, another course that I used when building the website that sells the magazine. And the best news is that the first 500 people to use the link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So get started today.